I'm going to keep my presentation sweet and short. So what I would like to discuss is basically why we're not seeing disruption in the investment banking and capital markets industry when it's actually ripe for discussion. So just to give you an overview of this industry, in the last 10 years, I have to say that it's an industry actually which is quite ripe for disruption because number one, we've had declining revenue pools. So last year alone, we had about globally 250 billion of revenues, which is a third less than the peak 10 years ago. There's been a wave of regulations since the financial crisis. There will be another wave of regulations hitting us in 2018 and 19, which will drive up capital requirements to be even higher. And why is that so important? You're talking about a typical investment bank on average, if I take, let's say, the top 10 global investment banks in the world, consume about 50 to 60 billion of equity capital alone. This is a lot of money, right? Which shareholders put in. And we're not including hybrid or debt capital. If you actually include that, the capital consumption in investment banks is quite high. So to imagine that if you have another wave of regulations, which is going to drive that 50 to 60 billion number even higher, there's a question about return on equity, the profitability of the industry or investment banks in general. The third thing that we should be aware of in this industry is we're operating in a very uncertain environment. So the elections that have been happening in Europe, the geopolitical events, we have ultra low volatility this quarter. It's a very strange world which is dominated by very quiet markets, punctuated by spikes in activity, mostly driven by these kind of events. So it's very hard to predict. And then lastly, which is the subject of today's discussion, is we do have new entrants in the form of boutiques. We have boutiques actually competing in the most profitable part of the industry, which is advisory. There's very little capital usage. It's all about intellectual capital, but this is the area that's been under attack. Boutique market share, just to give you a statistic, has grown to about 25% in the last 10 years. Then there are also electronic trading players. You may have heard of some of them, Virtu, XTX, all of that. These are also taking market share from the global markets businesses of the investment banks. You see a lot of that in FX, certain parts of fixed income, and also equities. So this is an industry which is very ripe for disruption, but nevertheless, this disruption isn't actually happening as we see. And why is that? If I flick to the next slide, well, disruption isn't happening because number one, the incumbents are actually adapting their strategies. They're optimizing capital-intensive businesses, also at the same time growing in less capital-intensive businesses. So incumbents are preparing themselves. They're also partnering with a lot of the Fintechs. They're also investing in Fintechs by themselves or also have accelerators to grow these types of technologies within the company. But also at the same time, if you actually think about what I just said a few minutes ago, this is a very capital-intensive industry, very heavily regulated. Yes, the environment is ripe for disruption, but because of the heavy regulation and heavy capital requirements, it's not the most attractive industry to enter. So for example, if you were to, let's say, disrupt equities trading as a startup, would you be able to offer market access in 30 plus countries, provide balance sheet, provide content in all those local markets? This requires a lot of infrastructure, investment, content from those markets, and also a lot of capital as a result. So it's not obviously the most attractive from a startup point of view. But we do actually see a proliferation increasingly every year of a lot of players. I've put some of these names because, as in my current role as head of strategy for the investment bank, I do talk to some of these because some of these companies actually do come to us and ask, can we actually borrow your infrastructure to do a certain part of a niche business that you're not looking after, or a certain part of clientele that you're not looking after? For example, small, medium companies, middle market, and things like that. So we do talk to them. Occasionally, we do have discussions about partnering with them, but none of these have actually reached scale. And that's where we are. And the tipping point from my seat is that we're actually quite far away from gaining critical mass. And, and the primary reason from our side is we are also very concerned about cannibalizing our businesses. But also at the same time, when we speak to a lot of these fintechs, I see increasingly many people actually coming from the industry, but there are also many people who do not understand the front-to-back operations, technology, the product in investment banking and capital markets. So often the case, I had a couple of discussions like just recently where I've discussed balance sheet optimization with a startup, but then I was in a position where I had to explain post-trade process, and that's how that's linked to balance sheet optimization. So without the, I think, requisite background in the industry, it's very, very hard to actually come in and disrupt ours. So from our point of view, the traditional investment banks from where I am, so where do we actually see the winners in disruption? I mean, we see several patterns. We see traditional investment banks partnering with fintechs. We see, traditional investment banks actually developing the technology itself. But at the end of the day, if you are in an industry where there's so much capital invested by shareholders in your company, ultimately, you have to deliver return on equity. And return on equity is, as written here, a function of revenue minus cost over equity. And there are things that we can do using fintech to reduce costs. For example, automation. On the revenue side, there is a lot of work being done, for example, in UBS, in our markets and research businesses, using artificial intelligence to actually target the right clients and the right opportunities. On the equity side, I think, this is probably the place where the fintechs are less penetrated because it involves this technical knowledge about optimizing balance sheets. So on different parts of the equation, because my objective and also my boss's objective and our shareholders' objective is to see the highest return on equity as possible. When I think about how to use fintech to actually increase that number, this is the framework that I use and also used by my peers. So how do we expect disruption to happen? This is an extremely simplified and illustrative way of looking at it. I mean, there will be verticals, front, middle, back, in certain sets of activities where fintech could be very effective, taking certain parts of activities from investment banks. Obviously, the collection of all of these activities by fintechs will mean that there will be a disaggregation of the vertical chain, which is still very much preserved in this industry. A lot of it will be driven by technology front to back, but that still has not yet to happen. And unless we actually do see very strong business cases for using fintech, I think critical mass adoption is still far away. So that's the end of my presentation. Any questions? I'm very happy to answer. None. Yes, ma'am.
So what is UBS doing specifically to facilitate the disruption that you think is so necessary? What is UBS doing to do the disruption that is necessary in the market, if anything?
We're doing at what any other bank does, which is collaborating with other fintechs. So we have our accelerator on level 39. Most of the investment and coaching that we provide are focused on blockchain. Then internally, we are, I think, pretty much ahead of the market on using artificial intelligence to identify opportunities. So I can tell you, our algorithms in research and global markets are sophisticated enough to know what you ate for breakfast if you give me a set of activities that you do for a month. What this means in practically is that we are able to predict what kinds of research or what kinds of trades that clients could be interested in well in advance. And actually our salespeople are able to take that information and market to clients. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? None.
In that case, could we just give Sohee a big thank you very
thank
much?
you.
Thank you.